In this video series, we'll delve into the biblical timeline of history. We aim to uncover the significance of important historical dates, such as the creation in 11,013 BC, the flood in 4990 BC, and even the date when God would bring judgment upon the house of God, the churches, as mentioned in 1 Peter 4:17. We'll also explore the date of Judgment Day, which is also alluded to in the same verse. And you might be wondering what the biblical timeline of history is and why it's important to learn. These dates weren't placed in the Bible arbitrarily. They serve a purpose beyond mere knowledge. God always has a reason for concealing truths within the Bible. These essential dates are not explicitly stated in verses, but require meticulous exploration through comparing Scripture with Scripture, the biblical method for revealing truth, mathematical analysis, and ultimately guidance from God's Holy Spirit. So what exactly is the biblical timeline of history? It's a timeline that spans across the Bible, beginning with the first book, Genesis. This timeline then extends into subsequent books and chapters. Why should we invest time in learning about the biblical timeline of history? The answer can be found in Ecclesiastes 8:5. Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. To comprehend the current time or season, understanding past biblical events is essential to understand when future events will occur that the Bible is prophesied about.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the third episode of the Biblical Timeline of History. I'm back here with Brian, and we're going to go back over the timeline, and we'll just continue. We're going to do like a review and go over some things we kind of missed last episode, and then we'll just continue on through the timeline. So I'll go ahead and get started. Brian, you can see my screen, all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So I'm just going to go over some changes that we made to the timeline. So if you go to the Kairos tab, I created like a little, I guess it's an easy way to identify if somebody was a immediate son or descendant. So if it has a yellow star above their name, it means that it's an immediate father-son relationship. If it has a white star, charism, and that means charism is used. If it has a gold star, if it has a white star, that means charism is not used. And there's only two exceptions to this, but we still know that they're immediate father-son. They had a father-son relationship. And then lastly, if it doesn't have any star, it just means that they're just a descendant. So just a nice way to identify what's being used. All right, so as you can see, Adam has a gold star because charism is used in the case of Seth. And then Seth has a gold star because charism is used in the case of Enos. And Enos does not have that gold star. We did make some changes on the timeline itself. So if you click the, for example, if you click Enos, right? It says Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. If you click on the yellow marker, now it shows that 90-year time frame, just so you can see that. So go ahead and click that again. And the same thing for each one of these. You'll see 70 years for Canaan.
And just to clarify, that 70 years and 90 years would be for the false timeline, not for the true timeline.
Right. Yep. Yeah, for the false timeline. And down here for Mahathio, it's the same thing. We got 65 years. So this is all if you read these verses take these verses at face value, you'll run into these errors, which goes to show you why you have to carefully compare scripture to scripture, or you'll find errors, right? And the timeline is actually a perfect example of that. So you got 162 years for Jared and Enoch, and it just goes down the line. So we're just going to go ahead and skip on to the Lamech. Again, he has a gold star because immediate father-son relationship is used with Lamech and Noah. Now, when you get to Noah, it's a white star because he's the exception. Kerasim is not used in the case of Noah and Shem. However, we know that they had an immediate father-son relationship, and this was already proved, I believe, in the last episode. So, but we'll go ahead and just read through this. I'm going to start with Noah. So, and Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. No Kerasim, because there's no, we don't find Kerasim, so we have to keep searching to see if it's an immediate father-son relationship. So this is the first of the two exceptions to the Kerasim rule, where Kerasim is not used, but we have proof of an immediate father-son relationship. And so here would be the proof of the immediate father-son relationship. Genesis 7:13, in the self same day entered Noah. Give me 1 second. Go. In the self same day entered Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah and Noah's wife, and the three wives of his sons with them into the ark. And then 1 Peter 3:20, which sometime are disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. So again, this just proves that these 8 lived together, including Shem and Noah. Okay. So this is just a quick analysis. Genesis 5:32. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, we went over this last time, and we proved that Shem wasn't begotten at 500, but he was indeed 502. That's when he was born. So you can look at these key findings. Noah begat sons beginning at age 500. There's the verse for that. Noah was 600 years old when the flood began. Genesis 7:6, and Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. The flood lasted 1 year. Noah went from being 600 to 601 years old. And you can read the verses there. Now, we did go through that, so I'm just going to come down here. Brian did explain all this before. And this might make it help make it easier to understand, but when God says that Shem was born 2 years after the flood, so he's 100 years old. Sorry, Shem is 100 years old 2 years after the flood. So if we look at this and we start the count at the beginning of the flood and count the year of the flood as one of those years, and then the second year, right, and then the third year, it wouldn't make sense, right? So we learned from Noah that we have to count the year of the flood as one of those years, and then the year right after. And again, we already explained that, so you can watch the previous episode for clarification on that. All right, so we'll wrap it up there. I don't think this was explained last time. So we know that Shem was 98. We know that he was 102 years after the flood, which if you just minus 2 years, that means he's 98 at the time of the flood. So this was explained last time. If you want to continue on this pathway, you can just do 502 plus 98. That gets you to 6,023. And then you just add the 7,000 years, and that will get you onto this timeline right here. You can also just take Noah's age from the time from when Noah was born into when he was 600 years old. That will get you to the time of the flood as well. And this just basically explains what I just explained. So the timeline splits off. We went through Shem's life last time, so we'll skip through that. So Arphaxad lived 30 and 5 years old and begat Selah. Now, if you click the false timeline, we would assume that he's born at 35, but we know Kerasim is not used, so Arphaxad lived after he begat Selah 403 years. So instead of 35 years, It's actually 400 and no, 403 years, but we also have to add the 30 and 5 years. So you add these together, 35 plus the 403 years, that gives you 438. So God now has it. When we get to Arphaxad, we now have to add up these two numbers here, beginning with Arphaxad. Okay, and Selah lived 30 years and begat Eber. Kerosem is not used. And Selah lived after he begat Eber 403 years. So again, we add the 30 years, and then we also add the 403 years, and that gives us 433. That's his total lifespan. But because Kerosem is not used, we place Eber at the end of Selah's life. Okay. Now, when we get to Eber, and Eber lived 4 and 30 years and begat Peleg. So 34 years. Again, this is a false timeline. Kerosem is not used. And Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. So what we do is we add the 34 years plus the additional 430 years of Eber's lifespan, and that will place Peleg at the end, being born at 464, right?
Correct.
Let me just refresh this real fast. Okay. Now, this is something that Brian thought was pretty neat, and we wanted to show. So if you click this second note right here, you'll see that Eber, according to the false timeline, would have outlived Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Abraham. And we didn't mention that last time, but he actually would have outlived even Abraham himself, right? So that would be a son, grandson, great grandson, great great grandson, great great great, and I think 4 greats when you get to Abraham. And you can see that it doesn't really make a lot of sense that he would outlive that many generations. Now, he did live to be 464, and if you add up these totals here, they lived in a time period of 366 years. Now you have to ask yourself, why would Eber live to be 464, and his sons not to? Why would his sons not live that long, especially if they're living at the same time? You know, what's special about Eber's genetics that make him live twice as long, right? So it just seems out of place, because if you look on the timeline, these guys here are living to be around 400 years old, and so is Eber. So it actually fits more that they're born after Eber, in a time period where man's lifespan actually cuts in half again to be about 200 years. So it fits a lot better. So this is kind of a little bit of confirmation that we're on the right track with the Kerosem, because it just fits the timeline much better when you see that. Just doesn't make a lot of sense for them to be born in this era. And there's no mention of Eber around the time of Abraham or Terah. So
Carl, could you just adjust your screen so it's a little lower so we can see your whole face?
are you seeing the timeline?
Yeah, we can see that too, but
All right. Okay, so we'll go to Peleg. And Peleg lived 30 years and begat Ru. Again, we see 30 years, but that's Kerosem is not used. So we take 30 years. And Peleg lived after he begat Ru 209 years. So we take the 209 and the 30, and that's Peleg's total lifespan, 239. And the math, again, the math is being done down here. You can always check. All you have to do is just copy this like that. You can paste it into a calculator. Pull up the calculator. And that gives you 9,006. So that lets us know that around this time, the Earth is, let me see if I did that right. This is for Peleg. I actually need to correct this. This is an error on my part. But you can see he actually lived to be, the Earth is 8,990 years old. And the BC year is 2914. I do need to check this, but I believe it's correct for these. Yeah, 7860 and 7860. Okay. All right, so with Ru lived 32 years and begat Serug. Kerasim is not used. There's the 32 years. And Ru lived after he begat Serug 207 years. So we take the 207 and the 32, that gives us 239. Now it's interesting to note that Peleg and Ru both lived to be 239. I don't know the significance of that, but it's just something interesting to note. All right. We'll go to Serug, and Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor. Again, Kerasim not used. And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters. So we take the 30 years, we take the 200 years, that's the total lifespan of Serug. And we add them together, that's 230. Again, if you take these numbers, they'll add up to 8568, which is the age of the earth. You'll see that here, 8568. And the BC year is 2445, negative 2445. You'll see that here. All right. Nahor, and Nahor lived 9 and 20 years and begat Terah. So that's 29 years. Kerasim is not used. There's the 29. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters. So you take the 29 plus 119, that gives you 148. Again, if you're following along, your mathematical calculation should equal 8,716 years by the time we get to Terah. You gotta push that back. Just need to check. All right. All right, now we're going to go over Terah. Terah is a little more involved, and you'll notice that he has a white star. And what that means is that, like we explained before, it's an immediate father-son relationship with Abraham. However, Kerasim is not used. In this case, there's no Kerasim. So just because there's no Kerasim, we can't assume Abraham's born with the same year Terah dies, like we could with the other ones, right? So we click the 130. Hey, Brian, real fast, do you know if anyone's in the waiting room? You could just check that just to make sure they're all invited
How do
in.
you check it?
Let me take a look. 1 second. Oh, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So Terah, we're going to go over Terah. And Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. No Kerasim in this case, but it's still an immediate father-son relationship. So this is the second exception. The first one was Noah, if you remember. This is the second exception to the Kerasim rule, where Kerasim is not used, but we have proof of an immediate father-son relationship, and we'll prove this in just a bit. So Genesis 11:32. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now Jehovah had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and will curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed as Jehovah had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years when he departed out of Haran. So here we know two things. We know Terah died at age 205, and we know that Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So we could assume that the assumption is that when Terah dies, right, that's the same year that Abraham leaves Haran. But the thing is, it's not very clear in this passage if it takes place in the same year. So we have to prove is Terah 205 Did Terah die at 205 and was Abraham 75 the same year Terah died? So proving Abraham left Haran the same year Terah died. We know from these verses that Abraham was 75 years when he departed from Haran. However, that what's not very clear is if Abraham left Haran the same year his father died at age 205. Although the passage seems to indicate that. This is a good example of the importance of comparing scripture with scripture, because we find in Acts 7, God clarifies this and gives us our answer. Acts 7:2. And he said, Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. Verse 3, and he said unto him, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I will show thee. Acts 7, or verse 4, Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. So verse 4 confirms that it was indeed at the same time, because it specifies that his father, it gives us a time frame when his father was dead, he removed him into this land. And so there we have our confirmation. Determining Abraham's age to see when he was born to Terah. Since we now know Terah dies at 205, and Abraham was indeed 75 years old when his father died, according to Acts 7, we just subtract the two numbers. 205 minus the age of Abraham, 75, that means Abraham was born when Terah was 130. And thus we establish on the timeline Abraham's born right here when Terah is 130 and not when Terah is 70. Because the verse up here would suppose that we don't know. The verse up here is kind of like the verse with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You have three sons, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And it just says that it almost makes it seem like they could be triplets, that they're born in the same year when Terah was 70 years old, right? But what this means is that he began to have sons when he was 70 years. But it doesn't mean they were all born when he was 70. And in fact, we can prove that's the case because we just proved Abraham was Terah was 130 when Abraham was born. He was not 70. So we know Abraham can't be the oldest child right there. And it just shows you, again, this is another proof that we're on the right track with not taking these verses at face value, right? We can't assume that just because it says 70 years that they were all three born when Terah was 70.
Okay. So I'm going to jump in here for a little while.
Sure.
And as far as the timeline goes, what we know and we can absolutely prove, I want to look at the parallels between our two exceptions to the Kerah-Shem rule. The first one being Noah to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The second one being Terah to Abram, Nahor, and Haran. As I said, this is an exception to the Kerah-Shem rule. We have another similarity in that it names three sons rather than one son. And one of the things people might say is we know that in the case of Shem, who followed Noah, he was not the oldest. And we know in the case of Abram from Terah, we know that Abram was not the oldest of the three brothers. So the question comes, who was the oldest? Who was the youngest? How does this work out? Now, what we can prove, and we did prove absolutely, is that the oldest of Noah's sons was born when he was 500 years old. And we know that Shem was born 2 years later when he was 502. And in terms of the timeline, that's all we need. Likewise, we can prove that the oldest of Terah's sons was born when he was 70 years old, and Abram was born when he was 130. And again, if you're looking strictly at the timeline, that's all that we need in a bare bones sense. But let's go back to Genesis 5:32 when it reads, and Noah was 500 years old and begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And if you do a little research, you come across Genesis 10:21, and it says, unto Shem also, the father of the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even to him were children born. And when you read this, you think, oh, okay, Japheth the elder. So Japheth was older than Shem, and we know, so then Japheth was first, Shem was second, Ham was third. The problem is that even though in the English it appears that the elder is referring to Japheth, in the book Adam When, Mr. Camping said that in the Hebrew, and the Hebrew is the divinely inspired text, which is without flaw, that the elder is a reference to Shem and not to Japheth, even though it appears to be a reference to Japheth in the English translation. So then at that point, we would be forced to conclude, and I did call, there is an eBible listener who can read Hebrew, and I did contact him and I asked him, and he did agree with Mr. Camping that the elder does correspond to Shem, not Japheth. So if this is the case, then that would mean that Japheth was younger than Shem, and it would mean that and that would make Ham the oldest. However, the problem comes when we read Genesis chapter 9, and we'll look at verses 22 to 24. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and went backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backwards, and they saw not their father's nakedness. Verse 24. And Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. So Noah knew what his younger son had done, meaning he had seen him naked. And of course, who saw him naked? Ham. So now this seems to indicate that Ham is the youngest son, which would mean that Japheth was the oldest. So we seem to have a contradiction. And the way we solve it is we dig into the Hebrew. Now, in Genesis 10:21, where we read about the elder, which refers to Shem and not Japheth, this is Strong's H1429. And it appears 529 times in the Old Testament. 397 of those times, which is the vast majority, it's translated as great. And the word translated younger in reference to Ham is H6996. That appears 101 times in the Old Testament, and it's translated small 33 times, little 19 times, youngest 15 times, and so on and so forth. And so looking into this a little more, we can see that these words can mean older and younger. For example, if you go to Genesis 27:15, you read, and Rebekah took goodly raiment of her eldest son Esau, which were in her house, which were with her in her house, and put them upon her younger son. And here the word eldest is the word elder, and the word younger is the word younger in reference to Ham. We also see this in regards to Leah and Rachel. If you read Genesis 29:16, and Laban had two daughters, the name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And coincidentally, or not coincidentally, because this is Bible study, if you look up these two strong words, H1419, which is our word elder, and H6996, which is our word younger, each of them appear for the first time in Genesis 1:16. And we read there, and God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars also. And both the words great and greater, meaning great lights and the greater light, those are both a translation of our same word elder. And lesser, of lesser light, is a translation of younger. So here we can see an application of these two words where it's not a reference to age. And it turns out that this word greater can be a reference to the elect. For example, we read in Genesis chapter 12 in verses 1 and 2. Now Jehovah had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation. And that word great, of great nation, that's our word elder. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And this first word, great, of great nation, that's the word translated elder. The second word, great, I will make thy name great, that's H1431, which is a different Strong's number, but it's a related word. And so this is clearly in reference to the elect. We also read in Genesis 21:8, and again, the word elder is translated as great in this context. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And of course, we know that Isaac is a picture of Christ. He can also be a picture of the elect. And so it was a great feast the day he was weaned. We also read 10 verses later in Genesis 21:18, arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make of him a great nation. Now, in this case, historically, God is speaking to Hagar in regards to Ishmael. And we do know that the historical figure of Ishmael was unsaved, and he can also be a picture of the unsaved. However, we also know that he is the ancestor of today what we call the Middle East, or the Arab or the Muslim parts of the world. And we do know that disproportionately that a great many of them are saved, more than a lot of other parts of the world. And I'm not saying that most of them are saved, I'm just saying a higher percentage than the world in general. And so he can be a picture of those descendants of him who are saved within the Muslim or the Middle Eastern regions of the world. We also read in Genesis 41:29, behold, there comes 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. So again, not a reference to time. We also read in Jonah 1:2, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city. And again, the word great is our word elder. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up to me. And we know that in the Old Testament, the greatest number of people that we read about being saved is in the book of Jonah in Nineveh. So this word can definitely be associated with the elect. Now, it does appear in a couple of cases, other interesting places. For example, now this is obviously not in regards to the elect, but in Genesis 4:13 we read, and Cain said unto Jehovah, my punishment is greater than I can bear. And again, this word greater is the word elder. Or in Genesis 15, verses 12-14, we read, and when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And that word great, of great darkness, is the same word, elder. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in the land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve, I will judge. And afterwards they will come out with great substance. And this word great is also the word translated elder. Now, I'm not going to do a complete word study and go through all 529 times where this word appears. But we can clearly see that this is not necessarily a reference to chronological age. So when it says that Shem is greater than Japheth, it's not saying that he's older. It's saying that he's greater in the sense that God is using him as the timeline patriarch. So God is going through Shem to put the lineage of all of Genesis 5 and 11. And it's through his timeline that we can we can go through the timeline of history. And for that purpose, he is greater than his older brother Japheth. So I do believe historically, and I can't say it definitively, I'm just looking at what I see. I do believe that in all likelihood, Japheth would be the eldest, Shem would be the middle brother, and I believe that Ham would have been the youngest, which means that Japheth would have been born when Noah was 500, Shem would have been born when he was 502, and Ham would have been born sometime later. We don't know. He could have been the younger twin brother of Shem, or he could have been born a year later. The only thing we can say with absolute certainty is he was married on the ark. So, I guess he would have to be at least 20 years old, which means that he would have had to have been born no later than Noah was 580. But again, we don't know. Now, moving on, we have a parallel with Shem, Ham, and Japheth to Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And we don't have anything that says that one was the elder or anything along those lines. However, we can look at Haran, and we see in Genesis 11:27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. So Haran, who is listed third, I believe is the oldest, just as I believe Japheth, who was listed third, is also the oldest of his brethren. And we know that Haran is the father of Lot. And in verse 28, and Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, Ur of the Chaldees. So Haran also died before his father. And in verse 29, and Abram and Nahor took them wives, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, the father of Iscah. So here again, we see that Nahor, who was listed second, who I believe is the youngest of the three brothers, just as Ham was listed second, his wife is the daughter of Haran, who was listed third, and I believe he's the eldest. So for that reason, in keeping consistent with the order of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and also the fact that he died before his father, and the fact that his daughter was married to his younger brother, leads me to believe that Haran was the eldest. And just one of the things which I thought was really interesting is we know that the oldest of the three brothers was born when Terah was 70 years old. And we know that Abram was born 60 years later when Terah was 130. So because of that, let's assume that Haran was the oldest of the three brothers, and let's assume that she was very young when she gave birth to him. So today, a girl usually enters puberty around 12, 14 years old. Let's assume that Haran's mother was very young. Let's say she was 15 at the time that Haran was born. Well, Abram was born 60 years later. So if you take 15 and you add 60, that gets you to 75, which means that Haran's mother would have in all likelihood been at least 75 years old at the time that Abram was born. And the reason this is important is when we read about Sarah, we read in Genesis 16, 1-4. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, Jehovah hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go into my handmaid, unto my maid, that it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened unto the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. So this happened, we read in verse 3, 10 years after they had dwelled in the land of Canaan. And of course, Carl went over, Abram was 75 when this happened. So this means that when Abram and Hagar got together, he would have been 10 years older at 85, and Sarah, being 10 years younger, would have been 75. And we read in Genesis 16:16, and Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. So obviously a year later was when Ishmael was born, when Abram was 86. Now, what does this have to do with Haran's mother? What it has to do with is Sarai gave Hagar to Abram because she thought she was too old to conceive at the age of 75. And likewise, as we went over, even if Haran's mother was 15 when she gave birth to Haran, 60 years later, she would have been 75, which means in all likelihood, historically, the mother of Haran would not have been the mother of Abram, which means that Terah had at least 2 wives. And actually, if you read Genesis 20, verses 11 to 12, it says, and Abram said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And indeed, she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. I'm sorry, I should have given the context. This is Abram explaining why he lied and said that Sarah was his sister rather than his wife. But he clearly says here that his wife, Sarah, has the same father, not the same mother. So he would have had at least one wife who was the mother of Haran, or the oldest child, a different mother for Abram, and yet a third one for Sarai. So we know that Terah had at least 3 wives.
Okay. Do you want me to continue on the timeline? We got about 15 minutes, and we can also open it up for some questions.
Yeah, that's it. I just thought that was interesting.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing, and we'll continue here. All right, so we just finished with Terah, right? So we proved that Abraham wasn't 70. Sorry, we proved that Terah wasn't 70 when Abraham was born, but rather 130. And again, you can see when Abraham was born right here. You got to look on this date. So you'll notice that we have Sarah and Ishmael listed on the timeline. Now, these aren't, I explained before, these aren't patriarchs, right? These are non-patriarchs. And what that means is they were given their birth year and their death year, but they're not necessary to progress on the timeline. And in fact, you couldn't with Sarah because she dies before Abraham. But there's still, still good information to share. So we'll go over that. So we'll start with Sarah. Sarah is the wife of Abraham. She is the only woman in the Bible that God gives us her birth and death year, at least that I'm aware of. She's a non-timeline patriarch. The lifespan of Sarah is not needed to progress on the timeline. So I explained that. So how to find out when Sarah was born? We know Sarah is 10 years younger than Abraham based off the following verse. Genesis 17:17. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? That means we just add 10 years to Abraham's birth year. Well, so you can see here that Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 90 years old. So we just established that Sarah is 10 years younger. So that means we just add 10 years to Abraham's birth year of 8846 EA. That's Earth's age. Also 2167 BC. So if we take Abraham's birth year, which is listed right here, 8846, because it lines up right when he was born, right there. And we just We just add 10 years to that, and that gives you 8856. So she was born 10 years later. So we have Sarah's birth year right here. And then if you want to find out the BC year, as long as you have the negative right there, you do the same thing. You just take negative 2167, that's BC. You add 10 years, and that will show you the BC year that Sarah was born. To find out when Sarah dies, just take her birth year and add her death age of 127. So now we have her birth year of 8856. So we just add 127. We can prove that Sarah lived to be 127 in Genesis 23:1. And Sarah was 127 years old. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So we take her birth year, 8856, we add 127, that gives us 8983. Same thing with the BC year. All right, with Ishmael, Genesis 16:16, Abraham was 86 years old. If you don't know how much a score is, it's just 20. So 4 scores would be 80. 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. Again, he's a non-timeline patriarch, but God still gives us the information to find out his birth year and death year. Genesis 16:11, and the angel of Jehovah said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because Jehovah hath heard thy affliction. And I believe this word, call his name, is Karasem. And Hagar bare Abraham a son, and Abraham called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. Genesis 16:16, and Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. And these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people. So we know that he's 137 right here. Now, we're going to stop at Abraham as far as the timeline, because we only have about 12 minutes left, and that's as far as we've made it. So again, you'll notice Abraham has a gold star. That means that Karasem is used in the case of Abraham and Isaac. And Abraham called the name, it's Karasem, of his son that was born unto him, who Sarah bare to him, Isaac. Now, we don't need Karasem because we know that Abraham and Isaac lived together. There's plenty of proof to show that, especially that he, during the sacrifice, when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. But God still called his name. So it just also confirms that he's an immediate son. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. So we know Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old. So we place Isaac at the 100th year of Abraham's life. And again, you can do the math, and that should add up to 8946 when Isaac was born. And the BC year is negative 2067 BC. And that's Abraham. And finally, Isaac. I don't know if I get into this. Yeah. Genesis 25:23. So he has called his name is used in the case of Isaac. So I put a gold star there as well. Genesis 25:23, and Jehovah said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And I believe the same word that Brian mentioned for elder is also mentioned here. Genesis 25:24, and when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were 2 twins in her womb. 25, and the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And I believe this is also Karasem. Oops. Genesis 25:26. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called, again, Karasem's used, Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years when she bare them. So we know score is 20, so 60 years. So Jacob and Esau were born the same year, but Esau came first. So he's a little bit older, but they're twins, right? So we know Jacob and Esau were both born when Isaac was 60 years old. And again, we can do the math. He's born in 9006. It's the 9006 year, also the 2007 BC year. Yeah. All right. There's just a few things I'm going to show you real fast, and then we'll open the room for some questions. So if you want to watch any of the timeline videos we've done, you can go to our YouTube channel. You can also click this new feature we added right here, timeline video series, and you can play the video right here. And the idea behind this is so you can actually follow along as you watch the video, and you can look on the timeline at the same time. Now, this is best done, I think, on a computer or a tablet. It's going to be a little bit tricky on a phone. And then if you don't want the screen so big, you can just press this arrow right here. That'll make it smaller. And then you can just play the video like that and just listen along. And if you don't, if you want to close out of it, you just hit the X. All right, and then one final thing. I think the first episode we had showed a feature called time paths. So if you click this, you'll see a time path. We'll zoom out here. You'll see on the timeline that we take a particular date at creation. And if we go to the flood, we have 6,023 years. And then from the time of the flood to the time of Christ is 5,023 years. And so you can see these time paths that we set up. And then there's an additional 2,000 from Christ to 2033. Now, I think what Mr. Campion pointed out in one of his books is if you take a time path from the account of when they're in Egypt, so this would be the 430 years in Egypt, right? That began in the year 1877 BC. And you press this little button right here. Well, first I'll show you this. So this is 1290, right? This is made up of 1290 years. The second one is another 1290. And the third one is another 1290. And that gets you to the year 1994. And what Mr. Campion also noticed is if you click this right here, it's also made up of 9 430s. The first 430 would be the bondage or the time spent in Egypt, right? 430. And then you have another 430, another 430, 9 times, and that also gets you to 1994. So just something you can check out on the website. And that should about do it. So we'll open up the room for
Well,
questions.
just to clarify something, the
Yeah.
1290, if you read Daniel 12:11, Daniel 12:12, it says, "Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and third." No, I'm sorry.
I can pull it up. What's the
I'm
verse?
sorry. It's Daniel 12:11. I'm sorry.
And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,335 days.
Yeah, so the 1290, that's 3 times 430, as we know. A day can be likened for a year. We read that, for example, during the spies searched out the land 40 days and they were wandering in the wilderness 40 years, a year for a day. And so if you take the 3 great tribulations, the first great tribulation is the 7 years of famine. They spent 2 years in Canaan and then 5 years in Egypt. And so when they entered Egypt, that would be the midpoint of that. And then, of course, 430 years later was the Exodus. But 1,290 years after that would be the midpoint of the second great tribulation, which would have been 587 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed the temple. And then if you take 9 times 430 and you add that to when they entered Egypt, that takes you into the year 1994. And that would be the midpoint of the third great tribulation. And all of those signify, in the first case, they left the land of Canaan. The second time would be when the temple was destroyed. And the third time would be in 1994 when the latter rain began, signaling the official judgment of the church, because God started saving outside of the churches at that point.
All right, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. We do have one question from Evelyn. Got about 4 minutes left. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, everyone. I had two questions, but you guys went over Lamech, Noah, and Shem, because it was kind of difficult to see where to start. If you take it from the flood, or if you just do just the men, the age of the men when they had their kids, whatever. That's explained, so I don't need a problem with that. But if you go to where the flood, see where you're at right there, right now.
Yeah.
It says flood 2, and then it has the arrow, and then below that it has another green line.
Yeah.
The green line where it says 7,000 and on, I totally understand that one. That makes sense. But the top one I don't understand, because I don't understand the part where it says 98 and why it's green. I understand that Shem is 98 years old when the flood began.
Right.
That makes sense. But I just don't understand that whole green line, like why it's said,
The
like
98 or what this
the
is?
98 I understand,
Okay.
but why is the whole thing green?
So the green, so anything that's in green is an event, some sort of event. So it's not a patriarch, right? So if you follow the pattern, we're going from patriarch's birth to patriarch. So
Yeah.
when I throw in when I insert the flood in here, it kind of throws it off maybe a little bit, to add a little confusion. But basically, we start from 6,023 because we know the flood began, right?
But what I totally understand what you're saying, but why the word where it says flood 2, it's just a little bit confusing to me when I was reading
Oh,
it.
I see. So
Why
flood.
doesn't it? Yeah, why doesn't it say
I
that in the green one and remove that big
So
green?
flood to judgment day. If you follow it,
Yeah,
through,
that's.
yeah. So this
Okay,
this
so
is
I
what
see where you
that's
did
what
that.
it is. Yep.
Yeah.
So 7,000 years. It's a little confusing. Maybe I could rearrange that.
The only thing, if you go back to where it says 98, if I would have followed it, like everything else, had that 98 not been green.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I was just
'Cause
trying
it
to
looks like a
separate.
continuation. That's what it mean. What I mean.
Right.
It just
Well,
looks
it
like
does go from. You do need to go from 502. That gets you to the year 5925, and then you need to add the additional 98 years right here, which equals 600, and that gets you to 6,023, and then you add the 7,000. That gets you to 2011. So if I were to remove the 98,
Oh, I see what you're
yeah,
saying.
now
And
you
now
don't-
that makes sense. That's what was confusing me. I just didn't understand this
No
whole thing right there just was very confusing. But now I
Yeah.
see where you're getting at. 98 has to be there because even
exactly.
though the top line is part of Shem, I'm just
Right, it only takes you to 5925. So you need that year from when Shem's born to the time of the flood to give you that extra 98. Or alternatively, you can go from 502 to 9 instead of doing 502 to 98.
right.
could-
You could do 600, right?
exactly, and it equals the same thing. 502 plus 98 equals
It's
600.
600. Yeah.
But
That's what
your-
I was saying, that you guys kind of cleared that up with the
Yeah.
men and their offsprings. But I just was confused with this flood 2 and then that 98, and then below that is 7,000. The 7,000, I totally understand why it's there. It's
Mhm.
just that top part that kind
Yeah,
of
and then
confused
the
me.
reason I made these green, just so you know, is I didn't want people to do 502 and then try to add up 98 and then drop down here, right? So I wanted people to go directly from 502. If they want to continue on this timeline, they need to go from 502 and drop down to 600, not include the 98 or the 7,000 right here. So
And
go
the 600 would be the entire 600 lifespan of Shem. So just like with Adam, where he lived 130 years and then Shem became the timeline patriarch. Here too, Noah would have lived 502 years, and then Shem would have been born when Noah was 502, and then Shem would have been the timeline patriarch for the entire 600 span of his life.
Yeah, he picks it up. Yeah, right here. So I hope that cleared up any confusion.
That's good. Thank you. Awesome. Thanks.
Yep. All right. Does anyone else have a question? Let's see. Doesn't look like it. And it's 6:31, so we'll close out and we'll begin our next program.